There was a time when these names ruled country radio. Their songs topped the charts, their faces filled arenas, and for a brief moment, they seemed untouchable. But when the hits stopped and the spotlight moved on, success didn't quietly fade. It collapsed. Behind the legends were broken contracts, empty bank accounts, addiction, and silence from an industry that once depended on them. This is the story of country superstars who reached the peak and lost everything when the music ended. Johnny Paycheck. At his peak, Johnny Paycheck embodied everything outlaw country stood for. He did not sing about rebellion as an image. He lived it. In the mid to late 1970s, his voice dominated country radio, and his presence felt dangerous, unpredictable, and authentic. When Take This Job and Shove It exploded to number one in 1977, Paycheck became a working-class hero overnight. The song turned him into a superstar, selling millions of records and placing him among the most recognizable figures in country music. But even at the height of his success, the cracks were already visible. Paycheck's lifestyle was built on excess. Heavy drinking, drug abuse, violent outbursts, and constant conflict followed him from venue to venue. While other artists were securing long-term careers and stable relationships with labels, Paycheck was burning bridges at the same speed his fame was rising. Nashville tolerated him as long as the hits kept coming. Once they stopped, patience vanished. The fall was swift and brutal. By the early 1980s, radio support had faded, major labels walked away, and Paycheck's finances collapsed under lawsuits, legal fees, and reckless spending. His downward spiral reached its breaking point in 1985 when he shot a man in a bar during an argument. The incident sent shockwaves through the industry. This time, there was no protection, no second chances. Johnny Paycheck was sentenced to prison, and his career effectively ended behind bars. When he was released, the world he returned to had moved on. Country music had changed. Nashville had no interest in redemption stories unless they were clean, polished, and marketable. Paycheck was none of those things. He performed wherever he could, often in small venues, relying on his past rather than any present support. Financial stability never returned. Health problems followed, fueled by years of substance abuse. Johnny Paycheck died in 2003, with his legacy reduced to a single anthem and a cautionary tale. He was once one of the biggest stars in country music. In the end, he lost his fortune, his industry support, and the career his talent should have guaranteed. What remained was a voice that never lied, and a story Nashville would rather forget. Image. In the early 1950s, Lefty Frizzell was not just successful, he was revolutionary. His smooth, laid-back vocal phrasing changed country music forever, influencing generations of singers who came after him, including Merle Haggard, George Jones, and even Elvis Presley. With hits like If You've Got the Money, I've Got the Time, and Long Black Veil, Frizzell dominated the charts and became one of the most important voices of country's golden age. At his peak, he had money, power, and creative control that few artists of his era ever achieved. But fame came faster than discipline. Frizzell had little understanding of financial responsibility and even less interest in learning. As money poured in, it disappeared just as quickly. Expensive cars, impulsive purchases, unpaid taxes, and bad business decisions quietly eroded his fortune. At the same time, alcohol became a constant companion. What began as celebration slowly turned into dependency, affecting his reliability, his health, and his reputation inside the industry. By the late 1950s, the decline was already underway. Radio tastes shifted, and Frizzell struggled to adapt. Record labels became less patient with missed sessions and inconsistent performances. The industry that once built him into a star began to distance itself. Unlike younger artists, Frizzell lacked a support system or management strong enough to protect him from himself. His chart presence faded, and so did the steady income that had once seemed endless. The later years of his life were marked by financial strain and physical deterioration. Multiple strokes, brought on by years of heavy drinking, left him partially paralyzed and unable to perform at the level audiences remembered. Medical bills mounted while royalties declined. By the time he passed away in 1975 at just 47 years old, Lefty Frizzell was no longer the powerful figure who had reshaped country music. He was a legend whose money was gone, whose influence remained, and whose personal downfall was rarely discussed. Lefty Frizzell lost nearly everything after his peak. Not because he lacked talent, but because success arrived without protection, guidance, or restraint. His voice lived on in others. His life became a warning. Nashville learned too late. Mel Street. Mel Street's career was built on heartbreak, and unlike many country stars, it was not an act. His voice carried a quiet despair that felt lived in, worn down by disappointment rather than polished by fame. In the early 1970s, songs like Borrowed Angel and Lovin' on Back Streets turned him into one of country music's most emotionally honest performers. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but audiences believed every word he sang. For a brief moment, Mel Street stood firmly in the mainstream of country radio. But success never translated into security. Street struggled to maintain momentum in an industry that increasingly favored image, youth, and crossover appeal. While his songs connected deeply with listeners, they did not generate the kind of long-term financial stability that protected other stars of his era. Behind the scenes, touring was relentless, money was inconsistent, and pressure quietly built. Depression, something rarely discussed openly in country music at the time, began to take hold. As the decade moved on, radio support faded. Record labels shifted focus, and Mel Street found himself slowly pushed to the margins. The bookings became smaller. The checks became thinner. Unlike artists with strong management or a powerful Nashville network, Street had little insulation from the industry's indifference. He was still performing, still recording, but the sense of belonging was gone. Country music had moved forward without him. The emotional toll was devastating. Street's lyrics had always explored loneliness, but now that loneliness was real and constant. Financial worries, exhaustion, and untreated mental health struggles combined into a silent collapse. In 1978, at just 42 years old, Mel Street took his own life. The news barely registered outside dedicated country circles. There was no industry reckoning, no public reflection on how a talented artist could disappear so completely. In death, Mel Street became a footnote rather than a headline. Royalties dwindled, recognition faded, and his name slipped from mainstream memory. Yet his recordings remain painfully honest documents of a man who sang exactly what he was living. Mel Street lost everything after his peak, not through scandal or excess, but through neglect, isolation, and a system that had no safety net for those who fell behind. Randy Travis. Image. In the mid-1980s, Randy Travis did what many believed was impossible. He rescued traditional country music at a moment when Nashville was drifting toward pop polish and synthetic production. With his deep baritone and stripped-down sound, Travis brought country back to its roots. Albums like Storms of Life didn't just succeed, they reshaped the industry. Radio embraced him, awards followed, and for several years, Randy Travis was the standard every new male singer was measured against. But the pressure of being the genre's moral and musical anchor came at a cost. Behind the clean image and faith-based songs was a man struggling to reconcile expectations with reality. As the 1990s progressed, Travis found himself squeezed between a changing market and an industry that no longer knew how to sell him. Younger artists arrived. Radio formats tightened. The same traditional sound that once made him essential slowly became a liability. Personal struggles soon overtook professional ones. Alcohol became a coping mechanism, and public incidents began to surface. Arrests, erratic behavior, and tabloid headlines replaced chart positions. Nashville, once fiercely protective, grew distant. Support quietly vanished. The industry rarely attacks its fallen stars. It simply stops answering calls. Financial strain followed. Touring opportunities shrank, major label backing weakened, and the stability that once seemed permanent slipped away. In 2013, Travis suffered a massive stroke that nearly killed him and permanently damaged his ability to sing. For a man whose identity was inseparable from his voice, the loss was devastating. The comeback narrative the industry often celebrates was no longer possible. In the years that followed, Randy Travis became a symbol rather than an active force. Honored at ceremonies, remembered in tributes, but no longer part of the living biz of country music. While he did not die in poverty, he lost his independence, his career momentum, and the power he once held in shaping the genre. Randy Travis's story is not one of moral failure, but of a system that elevates artists as symbols and abandons them when they no longer fit the narrative. After reaching the highest peak in modern country history, he lost nearly everything that defined who he was when the music stopped. Image Tanya Tucker reached the peak of country stardom before most artists even finished high school. At just 13 years old, Delta Dawn turned her into a national sensation, and by her late teens, she was already a seasoned hitmaker. In the 1970s, Tucker wasn't simply successful, she was unavoidable. Her voice carried a maturity far beyond her age, and her image blended rebellion with vulnerability in a way country music had rarely seen from a female artist. Money, fame, and freedom arrived all at once, with no preparation and no protection. That early success came with a hidden cost. Growing up in the spotlight meant Tucker never developed a normal adult foundation. There were no boundaries between career and personal life, no pause to learn stability. As the years went on, alcohol and drugs became constants, not escapes, but habits. Relationships turned volatile. The industry that once celebrated her youth began quietly judging her chaos. In Nashville, female artists were rarely forgiven for behavior that male stars were allowed to survive. By the 1980s, the decline became visible. Radio support weakened. Record labels hesitated. Tucker still released music, but the sense of control she once held was gone. Financial instability followed years of mismanagement and inconsistent touring. At several points, she found herself close to bankruptcy, forced to accept deals that favored survival over legacy. While younger artists were carefully branded and protected, Tucker was left to navigate her collapse alone. The emotional toll was severe. Depression and substance abuse deepened, fueled by the realization that the industry had moved on without looking back. Tanya Tucker had not lost her talent. She had lost the structure that made success sustainable. For long stretches, she disappeared from the mainstream conversation entirely, remembered more for tabloid headlines than musical impact. Though Tucker eventually found partial redemption later in life, the damage of her peak years was irreversible. She lost financial security, industry power, and decades of stability that most artists build gradually. Tanya Tucker's story is a rare example of a superstar who paid the full price for arriving too early. Proof that in country music, success without timing, guidance, and mercy can cost everything. Whitley. Keith Whitley was widely seen as the future of country music. In the late 1980s, his voice carried an emotional depth that felt both traditional and modern, bridging generations at a moment when the genre was searching for its next anchor. Songs like Don't Close Your Eyes and When You Say Nothing at All weren't just hits, they were statements. Whitley didn't chase trends. He made vulnerability sound timeless, and Nashville responded by placing enormous expectations on his shoulders. But beneath the calm, expressive delivery was a man quietly unraveling. Whitley had struggled with alcohol long before his rise to stardom, and fame only intensified the problem. Touring pressure, constant scrutiny, and the fear of not living up to the industry's hopes fed a dependency he never fully escaped. While his records spoke of tenderness and restraint, his private life moved in the opposite direction. As his career accelerated, warning signs became impossible to ignore. Missed commitments, erratic behavior, and growing concerns from those close to him painted a troubling picture. Yet the industry, eager to protect its investment, focused on output rather than intervention. There was little room for vulnerability behind the scenes. Success was expected to fix everything. It didn't. In 1989, at just 34 years old, Keith Whitley died from acute alcohol poisoning. The shock was immediate and devastating. At the time of his death, his career was still ascending. He hadn't lost radio support. He hadn't faded from public interest. But he lost everything that mattered most: his future, his stability, and the chance to turn success into longevity. In a cruel irony, some of his biggest hits climbed the charts only after he was gone. Financially, Whitley never reached the security that comes with long-term stardom. His catalog would go on to generate revenue, but he never lived to benefit from it. Personally, his death left behind a family, a legacy unfinished, and a sense of what might have been. Nashville mourned him publicly, but privately, his story became another quiet lesson the industry rarely acknowledged. Keith Whitley didn't lose everything because he failed. He lost everything because success arrived faster than help, and talent was mistaken for resilience. His voice remains one of the most respected in country history. His life stands as one of its most painful reminders. David Allan Coe. Image David Allan Coe was never meant to fit inside Nashville's rules, and for a time, that refusal made him rich and powerful. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Coe stood at the center of the outlaw country movement. Songs like You Never Even Called Me By My Name turned him into a household name, while his rebellious image attracted audiences who felt alienated by polished commercial country. At his peak, Coe sold millions of records, filled large venues, and lived the kind of excess most artists only sang about. But Coe's independence came with a dangerous blind spot. He had no interest in long-term strategy, public restraint, or financial discipline. Money flowed freely and disappeared just as fast. Lavish spending, legal troubles, unpaid taxes, and constant conflict with labels slowly undermined his stability. Unlike other outlaws who learned when to pull back, Coe doubled down on controversy. What once felt authentic began to look reckless. As the industry evolved, tolerance faded. Coe's increasingly extreme behavior and offensive material pushed him further from mainstream acceptance. Radio support collapsed. Major labels distanced themselves. Promoters hesitated. The same system that once marketed his rebellion now treated him as a liability. Without radio or label backing, income dropped sharply, and financial problems intensified. By the late 1980s and 1990s, David Allan Coe had effectively lost his place in the mainstream country world. While he continued to perform and release music independently, the scale was drastically smaller. Legal disputes over royalties and publishing followed him for years, further draining resources. Stories of Coe living in modest conditions, far removed from his former wealth, began to surface. The outlaw lifestyle that once paid off had left him without a safety net. Unlike some fallen stars, Coe did not vanish entirely, but he lost nearly everything that defined peak success. Industry power was gone. Financial security was unstable. His reputation became a barrier rather than an asset. Nashville did not publicly reject him. It simply stopped caring. David Allan Coe's story is not about a lack of talent or ambition. It is about what happens when rebellion becomes isolation. After reaching the height of outlaw country, he lost the money, influence, and protection that once surrounded him, proving that even legends can outlive the systems that made them famous. George Jones. Image. George Jones is often called the greatest voice country music ever produced. At his peak, he was untouchable. His phrasing, emotional control, and ability to turn heartbreak into something painfully real placed him in a category few could approach. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Jones delivered hit after hit, earning critical acclaim and the respect of peers who openly admitted they could never sing like him. Songs such as He Stopped Loving Her Today cemented his status as a living legend. Yet behind the voice was a life spiraling out of control. Alcohol and drug addiction consumed Jones for decades, draining his finances and destroying his reliability. He became infamous not just for his talent, but for missed shows, canceled tours, and erratic behavior. Promoters lost money. Labels lost patience. Nashville tolerated his chaos longer than most, but even legends have limits. At multiple points, George Jones lost nearly everything. He burned through millions of dollars, selling property and assets just to survive. There were years when he could barely function, let alone tour. His reputation shifted from respected icon to cautionary disaster. Radio still played his classics, but industry trust vanished. He was no longer a dependable investment, just a liability with a famous name. The lowest moments were deeply personal. Jones admitted to being isolated, paranoid, and physically broken. He hid from creditors, sabotaged relationships, and pushed away those trying to help him. For a time, his future looked bleak, even by country music's forgiving standards. Fame had not protected him. Talent had not saved him. He was losing the very life his voice had built. Unlike many on this list, George Jones eventually found a path back, but the cost was permanent. Sobriety came late, and recovery did not restore the money, years, or stability he had lost. His later career was built on survival, not dominance. The power he once held in shaping the genre was gone. George Jones lost everything after his peak: fortune, trust, and control, and earned back only part of it through hard-fought redemption. His story stands as proof that even the greatest voice in country music history was not immune to collapse when the spotlight faded and addiction took over. Image. For much of the 1960s and 1970s, Tammy Wynette was the emotional backbone of country music. Branded as the first lady of country, she delivered songs that defined an era, with Stand By Your Man becoming one of the most recognizable and controversial anthems in the genre's history. At her peak, Wynette was a superstar in every sense: chart dominance, international tours, major label backing, and a voice that symbolized traditional country values to millions of listeners. But behind the image was a life marked by constant instability. Wynette's personal relationships were turbulent, most famously her marriage to George Jones, which was defined by addiction, emotional volatility, and public collapse. While their duets sold records, their private lives drained her emotionally and financially. Medical problems followed her for decades, leading to repeated surgeries, chronic pain, and dependence on prescription medication. These issues quietly eroded both her health and her earning power. As the industry evolved, Wynette struggled to maintain the position she once held. Radio tastes shifted, and younger female artists emerged with carefully managed images and stronger industry protection. Wynette, meanwhile, was fighting battles on multiple fronts: declining health, legal disputes, and poor financial management. Despite her legendary status, she discovered that past success offered little security. Royalties were inconsistent, and mounting medical costs consumed much of what she earned. By the 1980s and 1990s, Tammy Wynette was no longer the force she once was. She continued to perform, but often under physical strain, relying on her legacy rather than industry momentum. Reports later revealed that despite decades of success, her finances were fragile near the end of her life. When she died in 1998, questions surrounding her medical treatment and estate highlighted how vulnerable she had become after her peak years. Tammy Wynette did not lose everything overnight. Her collapse was slow, quiet, and deeply personal. She lost control over her health, her finances, and her industry power, while still carrying the weight of being a symbol for country music itself. Her songs remain timeless, but her life stands as a reminder that even the most celebrated voices in country history were left unprotected once their peak years passed. Eddie Rabbitt, Image. For a brief stretch in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Eddie Rabbitt was everywhere. He wasn't just a country star, he was a crossover force. With songs like I Love a Rainy Night and Driving My Life Away, Rabbitt dominated both country and pop charts, selling millions of records and becoming one of the most commercially successful artists of his era. He represented a version of country music that felt modern, accessible, and perfectly aligned with radio's demands. But crossover success is fragile. As the decade turned, radio formats tightened and trends shifted. What once made Rabbitt valuable suddenly worked against him. Traditional country audiences viewed him as too pop, while pop radio moved on to newer sounds. The middle ground that had sustained his career collapsed, and with it went the steady airplay that defined his success. Unlike artists rooted deeply in one lane, Rabbitt found himself without a clear place. Behind the scenes, the pressure mounted. Rabbitt had built his career on constant output and relentless touring. When the hits slowed, financial stability weakened. Maintaining the lifestyle of a superstar without superstar revenue forced difficult choices. Major label support cooled, promotional budgets shrank, and the industry's enthusiasm faded quietly rather than dramatically. There was no scandal, just absence. Personal tragedy compounded the decline. In the late 1980s, Rabbitt faced serious health challenges, including the loss of both parents to cancer, followed by his own diagnosis of lung cancer. Medical expenses, reduced touring, and physical decline made a comeback increasingly unlikely. As his health worsened, so did his connection to the industry. Nashville does not wait for recovery stories unless they promise profit. By the time Eddie Rabbitt passed away in 1998 at just 56 years old, his name had largely disappeared from contemporary country conversations. His songs lived on through radio nostalgia, but the man behind them had faded into silence. Financially, emotionally, and professionally, the foundation he built during his peak years was gone. Eddie Rabbitt didn't lose everything through excess or self-destruction. He lost it through timing, shifting tastes, and a system that rarely protects those who fall between genres. After reaching extraordinary heights, he was left without industry power, long-term security, or a place in the modern country narrative. A reminder that even clean success can disappear when the spotlight moves on.